Picture yourself walking down a London street in 1730. But this isn't the London you know from tourist postcards. The cobblestones are slick with human waste. The fog isn't romantic, it's toxic. A yellow-brown soup of coal smoke that burns your lungs with every breath. But there's another smell cutting through the sewage and sulfur. It's sweet and acidic at the same time. Juniper berries mixed with something chemical. Something wrong. It's pouring out of basements, attics, and storefronts on every single block. You're looking at the deadliest drug epidemic in British history, and the drug isn't opium or cocaine, it's gin. Cheap, poisonous gin that's killing Londoners faster than they can reproduce. Within a single generation, this spirit will reduce the city's population so severely that historians will call it the Gin Craze. Though craze makes it sound fun. There's nothing fun about watching toddlers stumble through alleys drunk. Nothing fun about mothers strangling their own children for gin money. Nothing fun about mass graves filling faster than they can be dug. The signs hanging outside the dram shops tell you everything. Drunk for a penny. Dead drunk for 2 pence. Clean straw for free. That's not marketing, that's a promise. For the price of a loaf of bread, you can forget you're starving. For twice that, you can forget you exist. How did one of the world's most powerful empires nearly collapse because of a drink? How did the government not just allow this, but actively encourage it for profit? And why did it take 30 years and 8 failed laws to stop it? Subscribe to find out, because this story gets so much worse before it gets better. London in 1688 wasn't drowning in gin. The city had its problems: poverty, disease, overcrowding, but alcohol wasn't one of them. People drank beer, lots of beer. The water was contaminated, so beer was actually safer. It had low alcohol content, provided calories, and had been the working-class drink for centuries without destroying society. Then King William III arrived from Holland, and everything changed. William hated France with a passion that bordered on obsession. He'd spent his entire life fighting French expansion, and when he took the English throne, he brought that hatred with him. One of his first targets? French brandy. The English upper class loved their imported brandy, and every bottle they bought put money in French pockets. William couldn't have that. So in 1690, he did something catastrophically stupid. He passed the Distilling Act, which slashed taxes on spirits made from English grain and removed nearly every regulation on production. His logic was simple: hurt French brandy imports, help English farmers, boost the domestic economy. What could go wrong? Everything. Everything could go wrong. Within months, distilleries were popping up everywhere, and not just professional operations. Anyone with a basement, a copper pot, and some grain could now legally produce spirits. No license required, no safety inspections, no quality standards. The market was instantly flooded with a product that would make modern moonshine look like premium vodka. This new English spirit was called Geneva by the Dutch, which the English quickly corrupted to gin. But this wasn't the gin you'd recognize today with its carefully balanced botanicals. This was industrial solvent with juniper berries thrown in to mask the taste of whatever toxic additives the distiller had used to stretch their supply. And those additives were horrifying. Sulfuric acid to give it a kick, turpentine for that piney flavor, sawdust to add body, lime oil to burn your throat in that way people associated with strong alcohol. Some distillers even added lead compounds to sweeten it. They were literally selling poison, and the government had not only made it legal, but made it cheap. By 1700, just 10 years after William's Act, London was consuming 1.2 million gallons of gin per year. For a city of about 600,000 people, that's roughly 2 to 3 gallons per adult annually. Concerning, maybe, but not catastrophic. Beer consumption was still higher. Gin was just another option, a novelty spirit that was having a moment. But the moment didn't pass, it metastasized. By 1720, consumption had nearly doubled to 2 million gallons. By 1729, it had doubled again to nearly 4 million, and it just kept climbing. What started as a political gesture, a middle finger to the French economy, had become an epidemic that was actively killing the city that had created it. And the worst part? The government couldn't stop it. They'd created a monster, and that monster had developed its own economy, its own infrastructure, and its own army of addicted defenders who would riot if anyone tried to take their gin away. The crisis had officially begun, and London had no idea how to end it. By 1734, London had reached a tipping point that demographers still study today. The death rate had overtaken the birth rate. Let that sink in. In a major European capital during peacetime, more people were dying than being born. The population wasn't just declining, it was in free fall. The numbers tell a story that's almost too dark to believe. In 1734 alone, London consumed 10 million gallons of gin. With a population of roughly 700,000, that's approximately 14 gallons per person per year, men, women, children, and infants included. If you account only for adults, the actual drinkers, the number climbs to somewhere between 20 and 25 gallons annually per person. To put that in perspective, a modern heavy drinker might consume 10 to 15 gallons of spirits per year. The average Londoner in 1734 was drinking double that. And we're not talking about carefully aged whiskey or filtered vodka. We're talking about liquid poison that was probably 40% alcohol and 60% industrial chemicals. The physical effects were visible on every street corner. Gin didn't just make people drunk, it destroyed them. Skin would peel off in sheets, limbs would wither and shrivel. People would lose their teeth by age 30. The hospitals, particularly Bedlam Asylum, were overflowing with patients suffering from gin-induced madness, hallucinations, paranoia, violent outbursts that required restraints. But the worst toll was on children and pregnancies. The gin crisis introduced England to a phenomenon that would later be called fetal alcohol syndrome, though nobody had a name for it then. Babies were being born deformed, with neurological damage, with organs that didn't form correctly. And that's only if they survived pregnancy at all. Miscarriage rates skyrocketed. The statistics are haunting. 3 out of every 4 children born during the gin crisis died before their 5th birthday. Not from plague, not from smallpox, from the after effects of their mothers drinking gin throughout pregnancy and then continuing to drink while trying to care for an infant. In some of the poorest parishes, St. Giles, Clerkenwell, Shoreditch, 1 in every 4 buildings was selling gin. Not taverns, not licensed establishments, just regular houses where someone had set up a still in their kitchen. You could walk down a single block and count 15 different places to buy gin. It was more common than bakeries. The economic impact rippled through everything. Workers would show up drunk, get injured, and couldn't work for weeks. Families sold everything they owned, furniture, tools, clothing, dishes, to buy more gin. The pawn shop business exploded. There are documented cases of people pawning their shoes in winter, then freezing to death on the way home from the dram shop. And the children. God, the children. They wandered the streets in rags while their parents lay unconscious in cellars. They begged, they stole, they drank gin themselves because it was literally cheaper than milk. There are parish records documenting 5-year-olds being treated for gin poisoning. London wasn't just experiencing a drug epidemic, it was experiencing a slow-motion societal suicide. And the government that had caused it was paralyzed, watching the city die while counting their tax revenue from grain sales. The crisis would get worse before it got better. Much worse. Statistics can numb you. Numbers like 10 million gallons or 3 out of 4 children are so massive they become abstract. So let's talk about specific people. Real cases from court records and newspaper accounts. Stories so disturbing they're hard to read, but they're what finally started waking the public up. Judith Defer, 1734. She's probably the most infamous name from the gin crisis, and for good reason. Judith had a 2-year-old daughter who'd been placed in a workhouse, essentially an orphanage for children of the destitute. The workhouse had dressed the girl in new clothes before sending her home for a visit. A fresh petticoat, a new dress, clean shoes. These were probably the nicest things this child had ever worn. Judith met her daughter outside the workhouse. She took the girl's hand and walked her to a field on the outskirts of London. There, in broad daylight, she strangled her own 2-year-old to death. Then she stripped the body, left it in a ditch, took the clothes to a pawn shop, and used the money to buy gin. She was caught within hours. Her trial became a national sensation. And what shocked people wasn't just the murder. Infanticide wasn't unheard of in desperate times. What shocked them was her total lack of remorse. She showed no emotion. She'd traded her daughter's life for alcohol, and she couldn't understand why everyone was so upset about it. But Judith wasn't alone. The court records are full of similar cases. A coachman named Thomas Connors walked into a pawn shop in 1735 and offered to pawn his wife. Not as a joke, he was serious. He needed money for gin, and he was willing to leave his wife as collateral. The pawnbroker refused, so Thomas went home, stripped his wife of her wedding ring and clothes while she slept, and sold those instead. A cattle herder from Smithfield Market sold his 7-year-old daughter to a stranger for a gallon of gin, just handed her over in the middle of the market in exchange for a jug of spirits. The daughter was later found being used for labor by the buyer. The father faced no legal consequences. There's a documented case of a woman who put her baby in a chest of drawers and forgot about it for 3 days while she was on a gin binge. The child died of dehydration. When asked about it in court, the woman couldn't remember putting the baby there. And then there were the wet nurses, women paid to breastfeed other people's babies. Multiple cases emerged of wet nurses getting drunk on gin while nursing, causing the infants to become intoxicated through the breast milk. Some of these babies died of alcohol poisoning. They were 6 months old. The newspapers called gin mother's ruin, but it was ruining everyone. Fathers were abandoning families, sons were stealing from elderly parents. Entire family lines were ending because everyone was too drunk to maintain basic human functions. But here's what might be the most disturbing detail. None of this was hidden. This was all happening in public. Everyone could see it. The authorities documented it. The newspapers reported it. And still, for years, nothing changed. Why? Because the people making money from gin had more political power than the people dying from it. You'd think a government watching its capital city destroy itself would act decisively. You'd be wrong. Between 1729 and 1751, Parliament passed 8 different gin acts, 8 attempts to solve the crisis, and 7 of them failed spectacularly, often making things worse. The first Gin Act of 1729 seemed logical enough. Tax gin so heavily that poor people couldn't afford it. The tax was massive, £50 for a license to sell gin, plus 20 shillings per gallon on top of that. For context, a skilled worker earned about £30 per year. The intention was to price gin out of the market. The distillers found a loophole immediately. The law defines gin as any spirit flavored with juniper berries or other fruits, spices, or ingredients. So the distillers just stopped adding any flavoring whatsoever. They created a completely unflavored grain spirit, pure alcohol with absolutely nothing added, and called it parliamentary brandy, or cuckold's comfort, or lady's delight. It tasted like paint thinner mixed with rubbing alcohol. People drank it anyway. The second Gin Act tried to target street sellers. It banned public gin sales and required all spirits to be sold only through licensed establishments. The result? Gin sales went underground. Within months, thousands of London homes had converted their front rooms into secret gin shops. You'd knock, give a code word, get let in, and drink in someone's living room. By 1735, there were an estimated 17,000 of these unlicensed operations, 1 in every 4 buildings in poor neighborhoods. The third and fourth acts offered cash rewards to informants who reported illegal gin sellers. This was the worst decision yet. The informant system created a culture of mob violence. Anyone could accuse anyone of selling gin, collect the reward, and ruin a neighbor's life. Real informants were beaten, sometimes killed. Fake accusations became a weapon. The murder rate in London's East End spiked as gin-fueled mobs hunted down suspected snitches. There's a documented case from 1738 where a mob of over 300 people dragged an informant named Thomas Bensley through the streets and beat him to death in broad daylight. No one was arrested. The crowd was too large and too drunk to control. The government also tried raising awareness. They commissioned pamphlets, sermons, public health warnings. None of it worked. You can't convince someone who's drinking to forget they're starving that gin is bad for them. They already know it's killing them. That's not the point. By the late 1740s, Parliament had tried everything: taxation, prohibition, licensing requirements, criminal penalties, snitch rewards, public health campaigns. All failures, and gin consumption was still climbing. What finally worked wasn't force or fear. It was something subtler, something that worked with human nature instead of against it. But before we get to the solution, we need to talk about the man who changed the conversation entirely. William Hogarth, an artist who did more to end the gin crisis than a dozen laws combined. Because sometimes the most powerful weapon against a social crisis isn't legislation, it's a single image that makes people see what they've been trying not to look at. William Hogarth was already famous by 1751. He'd made a career of creating satirical prints that mocked the excesses of Georgian society. But Gin Lane wasn't satire. It was a horror show designed to shock people into action. And it worked. The print shows a scene of total societal collapse. In the center, a syphilitic mother, her legs covered in sores, sits on stone steps completely drunk. In her hands, she holds a pinch of snuff. She's so out of it, she doesn't notice her baby slipping from her arms and falling over the railing to certain death on the pavement below. This wasn't metaphor. This was based on real cases Hogarth had documented. Every corner of the image contains another nightmare. A man and a dog fight over a bone. You can't tell which one is more human. A barber has hanged himself in his shop. Business is so bad from gin that suicide seems like the only option. A woman is being poured gin straight down her throat by others in a coffin loading party. Buildings are literally collapsing in the background, not from age, but from neglect, because everyone's too drunk to do basic maintenance. In the distance, you can see a pawn shop with a line of people waiting to sell their possessions. A carpenter is pawning his saw. A mother is pawning her cooking pot. They'll starve later, but right now they need gin more than they need tools or food. And in the one thriving building in the entire scene, the gin distillery. It's the only structure that looks well maintained, with workers actively unloading barrels. While everything else dies, the gin business flourishes. Hogarth released Gin Lane alongside another print called Beer Street, which showed a healthy, prosperous London where everyone drank good English ale instead of gin. In Beer Street, buildings are being repaired, people are reading books, businesses are thriving, and everyone looks happy and well-fed. The contrast was intentional and devastating. The prints went viral, 18th century viral, which meant they were copied, discussed, displayed in shop windows, and distributed throughout the city. For the first time, the middle and upper classes who'd been insulated from the worst of the gin crisis were forced to look at what was happening in the slums, and they were horrified. The prints created political pressure that 8 laws hadn't managed to create. Something had to be done, and this time it had to actually work. The 8th Gin Act of 1751, also called the Tippling Act, took a completely different approach. Instead of trying to ban gin or make it impossibly expensive, it regulated it intelligently. It lowered taxes to reasonable levels, which removed the profit incentive for bootlegging. It stopped shops from selling gin on credit, which prevented people from falling into debt spirals. And most importantly, it promoted alternatives: tea, coffee, and beer. For the first time, a gin law actually worked with human nature instead of against it. Combined with a bad grain harvest in 1757 that temporarily halted distilling anyway, the crisis finally began to ease. By 1760, London's gin consumption had dropped to 3 million gallons annually. Still high, but manageable. The death rate began to fall. The birth rate began to rise. The city slowly began to recover. Today, London is filled with craft gin bars serving 15-pound cocktails to tourists who have no idea they're drinking the spirit that nearly destroyed the city. The slums of St. Giles and Clerkenwell are now gentrified neighborhoods with million-pound flats. But if you know where to look, you can still see the scars. The mass graves from the gin crisis are still there, paved over and built on top of. The old gin palaces, the ones that survived, are now trendy restaurants with no plaques mentioning what they used to be. The gin crisis killed an estimated 250,000 Londoners over 30 years, roughly a third of the city's population. It changed British drinking culture forever, led to the creation of modern policing, and proved that epidemics don't need viruses. Sometimes all you need is a bad political decision, corporate greed, and a substance that promises to make the pain go away. The ghost of Madame Geneva still walks London's streets. We just call her by different names now. For more untold history that reveals uncomfortable truths about the past, subscribe and hit the notification bell. The next story is even darker.